Montana Territory, 1883. The mountains stood like ancient guardians over the small town of Silver Creek, where the line between civilization and wilderness blurred with each passing season. Even in late spring, the chill of winter lingered in the morning air as Zara Mitchell stared at the charred remains of her father's livery stable. At 22, she had already weathered more than her share of frontier hardships, but this threatened to break her. "You can't rebuild it alone, Miss Mitchell," Mayor Holden said, his voice a mix of sympathy and practicality. "Not with your pa laid up with that broken leg." Zara smoothed her simple blue calico dress, her honey blonde hair tucked beneath a practical bonnet. "We don't have a choice. Without this stable, we lose everything." She didn't say what everyone knew. Her mother's death 2 winters past had nearly destroyed her father, and losing the family business might finish what grief had started. The frontier had taught Zara one immutable truth: dependency was dangerous. Her father had always said, "The only thing certain out west is that people leave, by choice or by pine box." She'd built her life around this wisdom, learning every aspect of the livery business, keeping customers at a polite distance, and never allowing herself to need anyone who might disappear when winter turned harsh or opportunity called elsewhere. As the townsfolk drifted away with promises of help that Zara knew would prove insufficient, she began salvaging what tools had survived the fire. Independence had kept her safe so far. It would have to be enough now. The afternoon stage arrived in a cloud of dust, bringing with it the usual assortment of traveling salesmen, mail, and a single passenger who caught the attention of everyone in Silver Creek's Main Street. He stepped down with the easy grace of a man accustomed to long hours in the saddle, though he wore no spurs and carried only a worn leather satchel. Grant Jackson surveyed the town with curious green eyes. At 25, he'd seen enough frontier settlements to recognize Silver Creek as a place caught between boom and bust, too established to abandon, not prosperous enough to thrive. Perfect for a man looking to put down roots without drawing attention. "Looking for work?" the stage driver asked as he tossed down the mailbag. Grant nodded. "Heard you might need a horseman." The driver chuckled, gesturing toward the blackened timbers at the edge of town. "Timing's either perfect or terrible. Livery burned 3 days ago. Mitchell's daughter is trying to keep things running." "But," he shrugged, implying the obvious futility. Grant studied the distant figure of a woman moving purposefully through the ruins. Something in her determined posture struck him, a solitary figure pushing against the inevitable. He recognized that stubborn resolve. It had been his companion through years of wandering after the war. "Where might I find lodging?" he asked, already calculating how much of his savings he could stretch while he assessed the situation. "Mrs. Barnes runs the boarding house. Tell her Hank sent you." Grant had come to Silver Creek carrying his own hard-learned lesson. The frontier demanded movement. Stay too long, care too much, and you'd only find heartache. His father's ranch had taught him that. The drought of '77 had destroyed their herd, their home, and finally his father. Grant had been drifting ever since, working cattle drives and breaking horses, never staying long enough to feel the sting when circumstances inevitably changed. He intended Silver Creek to be just another stop, a place to earn enough money to move on before winter, before attachment, before loss. Zara was struggling with a charred crossbeam when a shadow fell across her work. She looked up, irritated at the interruption, to find an unfamiliar man watching her with assessing eyes. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of Texas in its cadence. She straightened, pushing back a strand of hair that had escaped her bonnet. "I need several, but I can't pay much. I'm Grant Jackson." He stepped forward, extending a hand that bore the calluses of honest work. "I understand you might need help with horses." Zara's critical gaze took in his lean frame, the way he stood with the balanced readiness of someone accustomed to unpredictable animals. "No gun belt," she noted with approval, though the knife hilt visible at his boot suggested he wasn't naive about frontier realities. "We had 14 horses survive the fire. They're pastured behind what's left of the stable," she replied, gesturing toward a makeshift corral. "I've got contracts to fulfill and no proper place to work them." "I've built my share of corrals and stables," he said, already assessing the damage with a practical eye. "And I've never met a horse I couldn't handle." Something about his confidence lacked the usual frontier braggadocio. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered without need for validation. $5 a week in meals, she offered, plus a corner of the hayloft to sleep in, once we rebuild it. Grant's lips quirked in the ghost of a smile. That's fair, miss. Mitchell. Zara Mitchell. Their hands met in a businesslike shake, neither acknowledging the momentary current that passed between them, a recognition of something familiar in the other's self-contained demeanor. I'll start in the morning, Grant said, releasing her hand and nodding toward the ruins. Seems you've got a good foundation still standing. We can work with that. Zara watched him walk away, his stride unhurried yet purposeful. She reminded herself that he was simply a hired hand, temporary as all things were in the unforgiving Montana territory. Still, for the first time since the fire, she felt the tightness in her chest ease slightly. The following weeks established a rhythm of hard work and cautious cooperation. Grant proved himself invaluable, not only with the horses, but in planning the reconstruction. He worked methodically from sunrise to sunset, speaking little but observing everything. Zara found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. The way he gentled nervous horses with nothing more than patience and soft words, how he never wasted movement or materials, the quiet competence that drew respect from the townsmen who occasionally helped with the rebuilding. Your father taught you well, Grant commented one evening as they shared a simple supper of beans and cornbread outside the half-built stable. Zara looked up, surprised. How did you know? The way you handle the accounts. How you anticipated which beams needed replacing before I mentioned it. He used a piece of bread to wipe his plate clean. Most people have to be shown. You already knew. Pa believed a woman should be able to run things on her own if necessary, she said, her gaze drifting to the small house where her father was slowly recovering. He never expected to have a son to take over the business. Grant nodded, understanding the unspoken reality of frontier life. My father was the opposite. Expected me to follow in his footsteps exactly. When the ranch failed, he couldn't imagine anything else. It was the most he'd shared about his past, and Zara found herself wanting to ask for more. Instead, she maintained the careful distance she kept with everyone. We should finish the north wall tomorrow, she said, returning to safer ground. Grant accepted the shift with a nod. I noticed Thornton's mare is favoring her right foreleg. I'll check her shoes in the morning. Later, as Zara prepared for bed in the small room she'd occupied since childhood, she found herself thinking about Grant's hands, how they could be both powerful enough to lift heavy timber and gentle enough to coax a skittish colt. She pushed the thought away, reminding herself that admiration was dangerous. People who stayed too close inevitably brought pain when they left. The rebuilding progressed steadily through June and into July. The stable took shape, sturdier than before, with improvements Grant suggested from places he'd worked. Word spread about the quality of care the Mitchell livery provided, bringing new business from neighboring settlements. One sweltering afternoon, as Grant worked with a spirited black gelding in the newly completed corral, Zara found herself transfixed by the silent communication between man and horse. Grant moved with a quiet confidence, never raising his voice or using force, yet the horse responded to his slightest direction. He's got away with them, her father observed from where he sat watching, his splinted leg propped on a barrel. He does, Zara agreed, trying to sound merely appreciative of a skilled employee. Joseph Mitchell studied his daughter's face with knowing eyes. Reminds me of how your mother looked at me when I was breaking horses for her father. Zara felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer sun. I'm just making sure he's handling Prescott's gelding properly. We can't afford complaints. Her father chuckled, the sound rusty from disuse. Whatever you say, daughter. Before Zara could respond, a commotion at the front of the stable drew their attention. 3 men on lathered horses had arrived, their manners setting off immediate alarm. Grant noticed too, subtly positioning himself between the newcomers and where Zara stood with her father. Looking for Jackson, the lead rider announced, a hard-faced man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Heard he might be working here. Grant handed the gelding's lead to a stable boy before stepping forward, his posture casual but alert. I'm Jackson. The scarred man's mouth curved in an unpleasant smile. Well now, ain't that convenient? Morris Blackburn sends his regards. Zara saw Grant's shoulders tighten almost imperceptibly at the name. Don't know any Blackburn, he replied evenly. That's funny, 'cause he sure knows you. Says you cost him $5,000 and his reputation with the Circle M Ranch. The man spat tobacco juice onto the freshly raked dirt of the stable yard. Says we're to bring you back to Denver. Alive preferably, but he ain't particular. The atmosphere in the yard crystallized into dangerous tension. Zara moved closer to her father, whose weathered hand now rested near the shotgun leaning against his chair. Grant's voice remained steady. Whatever quarrel Blackburn thinks he has with me, it's a misunderstanding. I've never stolen from any man. Calling my boss a liar? The scarred man's hand drifted toward his holster. I'm saying you've ridden a long way on bad information. Grant's gaze never wavered. Now you can water your horses, rest a spell, and head back with my apologies for your wasted journey. For a moment, it seemed violence was inevitable. Then the scarred man laughed, a sound without humor. Boss said you'd try talking your way out. We'll be in town a few days. Think on it, Jackson. Come willingly, or we'll make things difficult, not just for you. His meaning was clear as his gaze swept over the stable, lingering on Zara. The three riders departed with deliberate slowness, leaving a cloud of dust and unspoken threats behind them. In the silence that followed, Zara found her voice. What was that about? Grant's expression had closed like a shuttered window. Nothing that concerns Silver Creek. It concerns us if trouble follows you to our door, Joseph Mitchell said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had survived decades on the frontier. Grant met the older man's gaze directly. I worked for a cattle broker in Colorado last spring. Discovered he was altering brands and selling stolen stock. When I reported it to the rightful owners, he lost a valuable contract. His jaw tightened. Seems he didn't appreciate the honesty. And now he wants revenge, Zara concluded, something cold settling in her stomach. Grant nodded once. I'll be gone by morning. You've rebuilt enough to manage without me. No. The word escaped before Zara could consider its implications. Both men looked at her with surprise. This stable isn't finished, and running from false accusations only makes you appear guilty. Zara's right, her father said after a thoughtful pause. Silver Creek takes care of its own. Those men have no legal authority here. I'm not one of your own, Grant pointed out quietly. I'm just passing through. Something in Zara rebelled against his words, against the resignation in his voice that matched her own long-held belief that attachment was temporary at best, dangerous at worst. For the first time, she questioned whether independence was truly safer than connection. You've helped rebuild our livelihood, she said firmly. That makes you one of ours until proven otherwise. The look Grant gave her contained surprise and something deeper that made her heart beat faster. It was a look that suggested she had just contradicted everything he believed about frontier existence, that people were as transient as the seasons, that helping others was a transaction rather than a bond. We'll see what the sheriff has to say, Joseph declared, ending the discussion. Now let's finish the day's work before gossip spreads. As they returned to their tasks, Zara couldn't help noticing how Grant's gaze followed her with new awareness, as if seeing something in her he hadn't recognized before. Her quiet strength in the face of threat had caught the cowboy's eye in a way her beauty never could. That evening, Silver Creek's sheriff confirmed what Grant had already suspected. Morris Blackburn's accusations wouldn't stand up to scrutiny, but the man's influence reached far enough to make legal proceedings complicated. The three riders had taken rooms at the saloon, clearly settling in to apply pressure. Could leave under cover of night, Sheriff Ellis suggested without enthusiasm. Might be simplest. And validate their claims? Zara interjected from where she sat at her father's kitchen table. Grant has done nothing wrong. The sheriff sighed, twisting his hat in weathered hands. Sometimes right and wrong matter less than who has the most guns or money, Miss Mitchell. You know that's the way of things out here. Later, as Grant prepared to sleep in the newly rebuilt hayloft, Zara appeared at the ladder with a lamp in hand. You're planning to leave anyway, aren't you? She asked without preamble. Grant looked up from where he was arranging his bedroll. It's the sensible choice. Sensible, she repeated, the word tasting bitter. Like keeping everyone at arm's length because people either leave or die. Like building walls to protect yourself from caring too much. His eyes widened slightly at her insight. Something like that. Zara set her lamp down and climbed the remaining rungs into the loft. The sweet smell of fresh hay surrounded them as she faced him in the golden lamplight. I've lived by that rule my entire life, she admitted. The frontier is no place for lasting connections. That's what experience teaches us. But watching you these past weeks, she faltered, then found her courage again. I'm not certain anymore that safety is worth the cost of solitude. Grant stood perfectly still, as if she were a skittish horse that might bolt at any sudden movement. What are you saying, Zara? I'm saying the stable needs you. Silver Creek needs competent, honest people. She took a deep breath. And I'm beginning to think I need someone who understands why independence matters, but isn't afraid to rely on others when necessary. The vulnerability in her admission hung between them, challenging everything Grant had believed about his transient existence. For years, he'd convinced himself that moving on before attachment took root was the only way to avoid the devastation he'd witnessed in his father. Yet here stood a woman who recognized that same fear in herself and was brave enough to question it. Those men won't simply leave, he warned, giving her one last chance to retreat to safer ground. Then we face them together, she replied with quiet determination. Because running from one threat just leads to running from everything that matters. Grant crossed the space between them with 2 strides. His hand, tentative but certain, came up to touch her cheek. You're the most courageous woman I've ever known, he murmured. Facing down fire and threats and your own fears, all with that same steady resolve. His touch sent warmth spiraling through her body. Zara leaned slightly into his palm, allowing herself this moment of connection. I should go, she whispered, though she made no move to leave. You should, he agreed, equally motionless. When their lips finally met, it felt like an inevitable conclusion to a conversation their hearts had been having since that first day among the ashes. The kiss was gentle, questioning, then deepening with shared recognition of something fundamental discovered in the other. When they parted, Grant rested his forehead against hers. If I stay, he said softly, it won't be just until the stable is finished. It would be because I found something I never thought existed out here, a place that could become home. Then stay, Zara answered simply. We'll face whatever comes tomorrow. She descended the ladder with newfound clarity. For the first time since her mother's death, Zara allowed herself to imagine a future that included something more than solitary survival. It terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Morning brought trouble, as frontier mornings often did. Grant emerged from the stable to find 2 of Blackburn's men lounging against the water trough, their postures deliberately provocative. Time to make your decision, Jackson, the scarred man called. Boss is getting impatient. Grant continued his morning routine, checking each horse methodically. Already made it. I'm staying in Silver Creek. The second man pushed away from the trough. That's disappointing. Means we do this the hard way. Does it involve you trespassing on private property? Zara's voice rang out as she emerged from the house, her father's shotgun held competently in her hands. Not aimed, but present. The scarred man's eyes narrowed. This isn't your fight, lady. You threaten my business and my... She hesitated only briefly. My partner. That makes it precisely my fight. Grant felt something shift in his chest at her claim. Not just the protection of her property, but of him as someone who belonged with her. 2 against 2, the second man observed. Not counting your gimped-up father watching from the window. I like those odds. Count again. Came a new voice as Sheriff Ellis approached from the street, accompanied by several townsmen. Silver Creek handles its own problems. And right now, you're the problem. The scarred man assessed the growing crowd with cold calculation. Blackburn won't forget this. He's got a long reach. Then he can reach out through proper channels, the sheriff replied. I've sent telegrams to the Denver authorities about his accusations. Seems your boss has more enemies than friends these days. A tense standoff ensued, broken when the saloon owner pushed through the gathering. These men threatened my barmaids last night and skipped out without paying their tab, he announced. I want them arrested or gone. The balance of power had shifted palpably. By noon, Blackburn's men had departed, their threats diminishing with the dust of their retreat. The show of community solidarity surprised Grant more than anyone. He'd spent so long believing frontier towns were collections of individuals tolerating each other's presence, not communities that defended their own. Told you, Zara said as they watched the riders disappear from view. Silver Creek takes care of its own. Grant turned to her, struck anew by her quiet confidence. In that moment, he saw her clearly, not just her honey-blonde beauty or capable hands, but the steadfast heart that had recognized his worth when he'd forgotten it himself. "You're the woman I've waited for," he said with sudden certainty. "Someone who understands that strength isn't about facing everything alone, but about knowing when to stand together." Her eyes widened at his declaration, a blush coloring her cheeks. "Are you certain? Yesterday you were ready to leave." "Yesterday I was still running from connections because I thought they made me vulnerable," he admitted. "You showed me that vulnerability can be its own kind of strength." Around them, the townspeople were dispersing, satisfied that excitement had passed. Joseph Mitchell watched from the porch, a knowing smile beneath his graying mustache. "The stable's nearly rebuilt," Grant continued, taking her hands in his. "But I'd like to stay, if you'll have me, not as an employee, but as a partner in all ways." Zara's smile bloomed slowly, like a flower turning toward unexpected sunshine. "I think Silver Creek could use a horseman of your caliber. And I." She drew a breath, taking her own step toward vulnerability. "I could use someone who sees me clearly and stays anyway." The crisis with Blackburn's men proved to be a turning point. Word eventually arrived that the cattle broker had been arrested for fraud, his threats against Grant rendered meaningless by his legal troubles. But by then, Grant had already committed to Silver Creek and to Zara. Through late summer and into fall, the Mitchell livery prospered under their joint management. Grant's reputation with horses brought customers from as far as Helena, while Zara's head for business ensured their growing success. Joseph Mitchell watched with quiet satisfaction as his daughter blossomed in a partnership of equals. They were married on a crisp October afternoon, the stable decorated with autumn leaves and lanterns. The entire town turned out to celebrate, transforming what might have been a simple ceremony into a frontier festival that lasted well into the night. When they finally retreated to the small house behind the stable, expanded over the summer with a new bedroom and kitchen, Grant lifted Zara across the threshold with reverent care. "When I first saw you standing in those ashes," he said as he set her down, "I thought you were the most determined woman I'd ever encountered. I never imagined you'd be my wife." Zara reached up to trace the line of his jaw, marveling at how natural it felt to touch him, to belong with him. "And I never thought a drifting cowboy would be the one to show me that independence doesn't have to mean isolation." Their kiss sealed promises that went beyond the vows they'd spoken publicly. Promises to remember that strength could be found in vulnerability, that the frontier's harshness was better faced together, that the family they would build would know both self-reliance and the security of connection. Spring 1884 brought renewal to more than just the Montana landscape. As the mountains shed their snow and wildflowers emerged in the valleys, Zara and Grant expanded the livery to include a blacksmith shop. Joseph Mitchell, now fully recovered, took pride in teaching his son-in-law the finer points of business management, while Grant shared his extensive knowledge of horses and cattle. On a warm May evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Zara took Grant's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "Come November, the Mitchell-Jackson family will have a new member," she said softly, watching his expression transform with wonder. Grant pulled her close, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought him from solitary wanderer to husband, business owner, and now father-to-be. "I once believed the frontier was too harsh for lasting happiness," he murmured against her hair. "That people like us were meant to endure, not thrive." Zara turned in his embrace to face him, her eyes reflecting the last golden light of day. "We were both wrong about that. The frontier doesn't just take. Sometimes it gives exactly what we need, exactly when we need it." As twilight deepened over Silver Creek, they remained on their porch, planning for a future neither had once dared imagine. The stable stood solid behind them, the horses quieted for the night, and ahead stretched years of partnership that would weather whatever the frontier might bring. Not because they were invulnerable, but because they had found in each other the quiet strength to face life together.